that happened.
Hello,
Yeah,
Ketchup
it's annoying
Crew.
that it keeps.
How's everyone doing? You can't answer, but oh well.
What time are we starting? Because it's past.
Well, round about now. I'm not doing the best job at recording before we start chatting, so sorry, Ketchup Crew. It's gonna be a short and sweet story. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. We are in the month of April now, with its first chapter, A Most Peculiar Business. The actress decided that although Lady Slickstone should be a person of honesty, she must not be played as a dull, straight heroine. She made no attempt to use the key until Sir Veronal was drawn to London on business. That night, she descended at Mrs. Banter's witching hour, 2 a.m, with a single candle, having first noted that Mrs. Banter's tower was neither close nor high enough to observe the manor's ground floor. The modest, square, windowless room had wall-to-wall shelves. Stocked with identical leather-bound books, suggesting more a room of records than a study. The numbers on the spines ran into the middle hundreds. High on a side wall, she spotted a volume with index embossed at the base of the spine. She climbed the polished oak stepladder, retrieved it, and sat down on the only chair at the only table. After a few pages, she realized that the index held a historical summary of a financial empire of enormous reach and antiquity, the volumes divided by title into time, place, and sometimes trading partners. For example, it listed Volume 1 as Trade with the Dutch West India Company 1623-24, Salt and Tobacco. Within 10 years, this mysterious business recorded trade with the Honourable East India Company, and by the 1700s with China. Over the years, the merchandise expanded into mineral resources, slaves, and gold. At intermittent intervals, the trading name changed from Slickstone, but always with stone in it. Waterstone, barstone, firestone, meltstone. She ran her torch over the shelves again. Unsurprisingly, the later volumes were thicker, despite being bound with finer paper. She returned to the index to find several volumes summarizing political donations, apparently to any party of note in every country of note, and then every 50 years or so there was a volume headed Black Book, of which there were 8 in all. She picked one at random, covering the period 1800-1867. It featured under the name Garstone, corruption trials, business scandals, murders of investigators, including a judge and a newspaper editor, alongside records of bribes, blackmail victims, and the fruits of extortion. She noted that the index listed the next Black Book, 1867-1923, under a different trading name, Turnstone. The recurrence of such unusual names, all with a stone suffix, could hardly be coincidence. She wondered how any criminal dynasty could sustain its efforts for so long. The geographical pattern was peculiar, too, a steady expansion to new countries while always maintaining a presence in the old. England featured late in proceedings. How could one family guard and expand such an empire without exposure? How could the heirs always match their forebears? How had so many generations ridden the fickle tides of historical change? She drew but one conclusion. Sir Veronal had inherited vast wealth from a criminal dynasty founded long ago by a foreign ancestor. index ended in the 1950s. The name Slickstone did not feature again, leaving it unclear whether Sir Veronal had continued the tradition. She saw difficulties ahead. How to inquire without looking suspicious? At least her part had acquired a new dimension. The audience would be watching her progress in the play with renewed interest. And what kind of play was it now? A history tragicomedy all rolled into one? The boy sat on his haunches and laughed. What better place for a criminal than a town without crime, police, or even rudimentary precautions? The hearth of baubles and relics still glowed. Outside, the shop sign squeaked as it swung in the light wind. The door had succumbed to a strip of plastic, but he had not been casual, knowing that for Sir V the worst crime was being caught. The ledger lay conveniently on the desk. He took out his note of the date and found the entry with ease. Rotherweird comfort stones, 40 guineas, him and salt. He relocked the door and slipped back down the golden mean. He found it strangely satisfying. All his life he had stolen objects, but he had moved up in the world. Now he stole information. The following evening, Sir Veronal returned. His character had evolved again, still the frustration but exuberance with it. The actress could not fathom the cause and doubted the audience would, unless she could reveal it, but his first interest lay with the boy. They sat in the library around a blazing fire. "Wine, Rodney," he said. "First the color, then the nose, and last the taste." The boy imitated Sir Veronal's treatment of his glass. Up to the light, under the nostrils, and then tilted back. Abruptly, Sir Veronal changed tack. "You have a report?" "Him and Salt, Sir V. He's a town hall gardener. He sold them for 40 guineas. "Where did he get them?" "The book didn't say." Disappointment registered on the old man's face. He turned to the actress. "This Mrs. Banter, you said she observes the late-night movements of Rotherweird citizens?" "So she said, with some pride." "Why?" "Knowledge of people is power over people," were her exact words. Sir Veronal smiled. Mrs. Banter was indeed right. "She records them in notebooks." The actress trimmed in the cause of credibility. Even a truth-teller would not confess that her own nocturnal ramble featured in one of them. "She told you that?" "She wishes to impress. She wants your favor." Sir Veronal dropped one of those offhand mysterious remarks that had become an increasing feature of his conversation since their arrival in Rotherweird. "I dislike the name Banter." He sniffed the air and turned back to Rodney. "Let me tell you, Rodney, among the most pleasing things in life is killing 3 birds with 1 stone. That night Sir Veronal checked his study, a traditional part of his security review in any home where the records of his empire were kept. His infrared lamp danced across the shelves. The spray had been of his own devising, leaving the finest film on the spines of the books, invisible but sensitive to human skin. Smudges shone in the gloom like footprints in sand. The interloper had been selective. The index, an early volume or 2, and disturbingly one of the black books. Sir Veronal held the only duplicate key in London. He had taken the actress's fingerprints from the very first glass she had held in his employment. He speedily convicted her, but deferred sentence. She could make no move while confined to the manor. The records did not come close to the whole truth, and he had backstories in abundance should anyone penetrate the complexities of the corporate veil. Also, he had more pressing concerns, first and foremost, locating the white tile. He did take the precaution of adding a second lock. He retired early. In his bedroom, he opened a square wooden box with ventilation holes on his dressing table and lay on his four-poster opposite, head propped up on the pillows. The creatures rose, shadows dancing in the light of the single candle on his bedroom mantelpiece. Sir Veronal lay on his back, eyes closed, listening for the flap of the moth and the buzz of the flies. Slow and fast, different flight patterns, different targets. In the old days, he had made it an art form. 10 fingers, a filigree of electricity joining and arcing. Take it slowly, he said to himself. Draw on the buried memory. By the early hours, he could throw a crackling line from a single finger and sustain it. Tiny bodies lay strewn across the floor. Two. A commission. 2 days before the commencement of term, Aggs delivered a note from the headmaster. Them's rare in the holidays, she said. Either he's got a special task or you're in the doghouse. Oblong, anxious about his reports, was relieved to discover that the note fell in the former category. Oblong, too much time on hands, unsatisfactory, have tasks so talent will out. Report 6-ish. RS, square brackets, H/M. At 6 o'clock precisely, Oblong knocked on the headmaster's door. Come in, replied the door wearily. Spring it might be, but the easterly breeze had a cutting edge. Oblong found himself addressing the headmaster's backside as Rhombus Smith addressed the hearth. When life and the burdens of office get you down, light a fire. Ancient Smith family saying. There followed a flicker of flame, a violent blowing noise, an oath, and then nothing. As many books littered the floor as the shelves interspersed with school messages spent like paper darts. Allow me. Rhombus Smith had many gifts, but apparently igniting firewood was not one of them, despite the family motto. He had balled the paper too tight, pressed down the twigs too hard, and mixed greenwood with the dead and dry. Oblong began to dismantle. Good man. Enthusiasm, whether in cheering a boundary or complimenting his staff, was the headmaster's trademark virtue. He talked as Oblong relayed the fire. History has been pruned next term. Sorry about that, but Mr. Snorkel was most insistent. I take it to be a reaction to Miss Valorhan dabbling in old history, which his worship put down to your predecessor. He paused. Anyway, Midsummer Day features the most dismal act in the academic calendar, prize-giving, an exercise that puffs up the already conceited and depresses everybody else, and I include the parents. There's a fair of sorts in the evening, but nowadays it's little more than coconut shies, candy floss, and palm readers. The best bit is, or at least should be, the school theatrical show that follows the prizes. Every year it's a different form, and I thought you might do the honors this year, on these lines. Mr. Smith handed over 2 pieces of paper, both written in the same hand. The first, a letter. Dear Headmaster, Midsummer Show. I attach an excerpt from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I commend as a theme for the Midsummer Show. It appears to have all the ingredients: hero, monster, damsel, and local connection. Signed, an admirer. And the second, an attachment with an instant familiarity. Strange reports from the village of Rotherweird. A druid priest tells that a monster came to their midsummer fair with the midsummer flower. All were saved by the green man and the hammer. Square brackets ASC 1017. Oblong's left hand flew to his mouth. The writing of ASC 1017 bore an uncanny resemblance to the identical entry in Robert Flask's notebook. May I ask, sir, when you got this? Does it matter? I just wondered. It came a few months ago, anonymous bizarrely, but the point is, Oblong, would you organize it? He saw Oblong wavering. My dear boy, it's meant to be a privilege. What about the history regulations? I didn't say research the past. I said organize a show. It's utter bunk, but isn't that how good theatre works? You've all the staple ingredients. Local theme, goody, baddie, damsel up the creek without the proverbial. And why not in verse, so it rollicks along? A pacey ballad about old Rotherweird. All right, stammered Oblong, remembering Fanguin's recommendation of the ballad form for a juvenile audience. Why not? Splendido, cried Smith as the reassembled fire burst into life. And how's young Slickstone doing? He seems the model pupil. A form's dynamic is a delicate animal, replied Smith cryptically before showing Oblong out. Oblong left in part downcast, the ballad not being his preferred form, and in part uplifted, a chance to shine. Pacing the quad, deeper questions surfaced on Flask, frescoes, and fairs. Flask must be a sentimentalist, still striving to connect Rotherweird to her history, despite his dismissal. Reenacting the chronicle legend was nonetheless an inspired choice, the legend so outlandish that surely nobody could invoke the history regulations. But was it gibberish? He recalled the white flower in the church wall fresco, which must be 11th century at the latest. His rational side could only agree with Dr. Pendle. The monks had been at the mushrooms. Instinct, however, delivered an inexplicable unease. Oblong rehearsed in front of his bathroom mirror the presentation of his new commission. He must inspire. Class, the prize-giving play has been awarded to us this year. You act it, I write it, and your parents make the costumes. Rodney sniffed an opportunity for his overdue vengeance on the countrysiders. Plot? He asked. Cast? Added Collier. Oblong read out the entry from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. When he reached the monster, Collier, Slickstone's neighbour and lieutenant, shrieked, Collier's dad! Thank you, Collier. In short, a monster tries it on with a village girl, but she's rescued by a local knight known as the Hammer. Slickstone intervened again. It's a Form 4 effort. Of course, said Oblong. We have 10 weeks to produce a masterpiece. Then you'd better get writing, sir. The voice sounded new, stripped of any pretense of deference. And if it's a form effort, the form should surely decide the cast. Hear, hear, said the front 3 rows, Rodney's placeman. I suggest 2 for the monster, sir, like the pantomime horse. All right, added Oblong, with the same queasy feeling that had dogged him at Wyvern Lane. He was not in control. Those in front of him were. Show of hands, declared Slickstone. The resulting cast was predictable. Knight, Rodney Slickstone, Squire, Sam Collier, Damsel, to be decided, Monster Rear, Ned Gully, Monster Front, Gwen Ferdy. Oblong rightly attributed Rodney's adjournment of the damsel's part to his desire for longer to survey the field, but he could not explain the transformation in the boy, nor the fervor of his hatred for countrysiders. He felt weak for having succumbed to it. That was the trouble with taking hospitality from the very rich. Rodney could not wait for the day when Sir Veronal took over the town, as surely he would. Only his ambition to be heir apparent moderated his behavior. He knew Sir Veronal would purge the countrysiders when the time came, but he had to make his own demonstration, and Rotherweird's rituals had gifted him the opportunity. The following evening he asked Collier round to the manor. Ordinary knights have swords, he said. I do metal work, only prize I ever won. But I'm the hammer, so I need a special weapon. Can you make me a special hammer with teeth that go round? The image of a chainsaw appealed to Rodney. Sure, but I'd need a furnace and the parts. Come with me, replied Rodney. In the basement he showed Collier a furnace as good as any the school could offer. Forge a weapon to be remembered. I don't want some common mace. He pointed at the circular saw on a nearby table, metal teeth gleaming. Collier put the glee in his new friend's face down to show, or rather he decided that his own interests required him to give the heir of the manor the benefit of the doubt. In April, him and Salt plaited spent daffodil leaves like a Martian hairdresser. In Grove Gardens, the early shrubs were in bloom. The rich scent of azaleas induced visitors to sit and muse on nothing in particular. Hayman's galanthy held their yellow-white heads aloft. Salt brought science and observation to his gardening. Take snails. Salt knew from observation how they hibernated, their nocturnal habits and impressive lifespan, beyond 20 years for some whose shell Salt had spotted with paint as a young man. He knew from Fangwin that snails could see and hear, and mated to breed despite being hermaphrodites. By night, Salt collected from the municipal beds the 4 harmful species of slug, for transportation to the outer reaches of the island field, leaving the other 20 species to continue their good work. Slugs are snails without shells. Thoughts about evolution constantly brought Lost Acre to mind. He made regular nocturnal pilgrimages to the White Tile, but the surface remained dead to the touch. The Weasel Man had believed in the possibility of a rescuer, but how, with the portal closed and Ferensen, the one man who might know, so aloof? The old man swung between favoring Lost Acre's destruction and anxiety over an unspecified consequence of such an outcome. He supported a snowdrop on the tip of his little finger. Bloom, slumber, rebirth. Seculum. Oblong wrote out his chosen title, The Ballad of the Midsummer Fair, repeatedly, in varying boldness and script, but still he could not get launched. His opening verses sounded trite and undramatic. He worried that teaching worked the safer channels of the brain and neglected more offbeat paths where inspiration lurked. Mindful of the example of Thomas de Quincey, he caught Miss Trimble at a rare moment when the porter's lodge was traffic-free. How is Professor Bolitho? He's in a night owl phase. Nobody sees him. I'd like to see him. I could do with one of his specials. Many of us could, but when he's fishing the heavens, he's a different person. I take him food and the rudiments, but he barely registers. It's that kind of work. She gave Oblong a firm look. I see endless teachers with hardly an explorer among them. He's a man to be treasured. The answer loosened Oblong's previous two-dimensional assessment of Miss Trimble. I don't need long, and my diary has spaces. In truth, Oblong's diary was all spaces. If you want to see him, go to his lecture in School Hall. It's a professorship commitment. You'd best get there early. Oblong did not regret taking Miss Trimble's advice. Every faculty had turned out, and every form packing the largest chamber in Rotherweird school. A surprised murmur greeted Valorhan's appearance, an unprecedented visit by a North Tower scientist to a South Tower lecture. Bolitho turned the lights out and announced in his sing-song voice through speakers, hidden high in the hammer beam roof. A time before time. White particles darted about the ceiling. The proton, the electron, the neutron. Dark particles suddenly emerged and pursued them. The antiproton, the antineutron, and the anti-electron. They have the same mass as their positive twins, but an opposing electrical charge. Put them together and they mutually self-destruct. Let us imagine this primitive duel. A Big Bang, or rather the Big Bang, detonated under Bolitho's lectern. Proton and antiproton disappeared, only for a new-formed galaxy to spin over the heads of a startled audience, a hologram of Bolitho's devising. Early theory, continued Bolitho, had matter and antimatter in equal quantities. A boneheaded view, as they would have cancelled each other out, leaving no form for anything. Next up, the boffins suggest that matter had the advantage by one, meaning that the minuscule early universe was what, Symes? Every Bolitho performance featured ambush questions. They prevented drift. Asymmetrical, sir, stuttered the sixth former. Not as bright as Symes. We assume matter won the day, but did it? He slid briefly into complex physics before abruptly changing the subject to astronomy. I turned to the question of comets. Clear the floor, boys and girls. It's time to fashion a solar system in which I shall play the forces of nature. With a long cane, Bolitho selected a mix of pupils of both sexes to play the sun and the planets, acting with the decisiveness Oblong's casting of form-force play had lacked. The exercise had apparently been done before. In minutes, a central space became a human astrolabe, planets rotating as they orbited a central sun. For the uninitiated, their order is. The older pupils intoned Bolitho's unusual mnemonic for the order of the planets. My versifying elephant mixes jolly, strong, uplifting negritas pensively. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Oblong joined the applause, only to find Bolitho's wand pointing directly at him. Mr. Oblong will be our system's resident outsider, a ball of dirty ice and cosmic dust. Step forward, man. You are at Aphelion, the furthest point from Dawson Minor, alias the sun. You have a tale 1,000,000 miles long. On planet Earth, Egyptians struggle with the basics of astronomy, and our island is a swamp for paddling primitives. Imagine what forces Comet Oblong might unleash. Oblong caught a wave of half-suppressed laughter from his audience as he walked slowly towards the sun. Bolitho had cast 2 girls and a boy to follow him as fragments of his tale, spinning them into Earth as meteors. Suppose Oblong were made of dark matter. What then? More giggling as Oblong reached Earth. By now, Saxon battles Dane, and Englishmen can write, announced Bolitho. So the lecture played out, a fusillade of facts, theory, performance art, and stand-up, which left the audience as exhausted as the speaker. Next term, I shall educate you about the differences between matter, antimatter, dark matter, and negative matter, concluded Bolitho. Bellerhand hung back at the end, as did Oblong. She ignored the historian and only offered Bolitho a question. No thanks or compliments. I assume antimatter requires an anti-periodic table? Bolitho had the wit to realize that his usual small talk would cut no ice with Bellerhand. Surely, an antimatter can bind together just as matter does. She flicked her head back to Bolitho as she moved through the doorway, too casually not to be rehearsed. Another time, perhaps, she said. Bolitho tapped her shoulder gently in response. On one level, diplomatic relations had been opened, but Oblong sensed a deeper engagement, from Bolitho particularly, which he could not decipher. He seized his moment. Terrific, Professor. I dare say you need a sharpener after that. I've a new creation, the slow burner, but she has to wait. It's the fishing season, you see. Miss Trimble materialized and steered Oblong away. Night work, he means. You won't be seeing him for weeks. Falling prey to that siren voice which says that what you do not have is what you need, Oblong headed home in a gloom. The slow burner would surely have dissolved his writer's block as a candle melts wax. Three. Sir Veronal makes a move. The message appeared in Strimmer's pigeonhole in the porter's lodge. The watermark of a weasel's head on the envelope was as good as a signature. The note inside came straight to the point. 13 Old Ley Lane. First floor, neutral territory, only you and me. 12 noon. No strings, no conditions, no recriminations, no second chance. The North Tower interests me. Kind regards, Sir Veronal Slickstone. Strimmer smiled at the words, kind regards. This man did not deal in kindness. The letter contained no mention of a reply. Sir Veronal knew he would come. He would, however, tread carefully. He faced a second dilemma. The quality of Sir Veronal's collection of old books had filtered through by Oblong and those children who had been invited by the young Slickstone to the manor. Sir Veronal might pay well for the Roman recipe book. If not, he might at least enlighten him about its subject matter. The last sentence of the message carried ambiguity. He recalled Veronal's interest in Flask. Was the newcomer interested in the North Tower's current work, or its history, or indeed both? Nothing ventured, nothing gained, Strimmer decided. He felt an urge not to disappoint. Strimmer found the door of 13 Old Ley Lane unlocked. The walls, though bare, were tastefully painted and the floor swept. In Rotherweird's crowded streets, the ability to command an empty house spoke eloquently of Sir Veronal's power and Snorkel's subservience. His host's affection for candles persisted. Creamy yellow beeswax on giltwood torchères in the hallway and on the landing above. Light from another illuminated the single large room on the first floor. 2 chairs faced each other across a round table, on which stood a fine period cut glass decanter and 2 tumblers of the same design. The decanter held iced water with slices of lime. Neutral ground was the message. Sir Veronal emerged from the shadows to greet him. Shall we sit down? They did so. Strimmer approved, no flannel. Sir Veronal filled the glasses. I propose some rules. We tell no lies, but we may decline to answer any question or any part of a question. We ask alternately. Your involvement in your colleague's pitiful stunt at my party is an irrelevance. I'm interested in what you have to say, and I'm not hostile. I assume your position is the same. He paused before adding, the facts of this meeting and our exchanges are confidential on pain of death. Sir Veronal spoke in a matter-of-fact tone. Strimmer nodded acceptance. I'm the host. You go first. Why by the manor? In search of my past, which lies here somewhere. I believe it was erased by some cataclysmic event, which, ex hypothesi, I cannot remember. Sir Veronal told the truth about his arrival in Rotherweird. He just ignored what his dreams had revealed since. Surprisingly open, thought Strimmer, save that nobody had ever suggested that Sir Veronal had been to Rotherweird before. Another damned mystery. It was Sir Veronal's turn. Have you fully explored the North Tower? There's an old classroom above my study, long sealed off. Strimmer decided to be more forthcoming. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was an observatory, but the telescope is gone. Sir Veronal smiled appreciatively. Strimmer took the plunge. What do you make of this? He said, placing the slim leather-bound volume on the table. Sir Veronal's eyes narrowed. He picked up a book, sniffed it, rubbed the spine with his index finger, and weighed the whole in his hand. It was an act. The moment he saw the title, The Roman Recipe Book, he knew, for now his memory had blossomed, making connections rather than merely retrieving moments at random. More locked doors opened as he struggled to suppress his excitement. With a small gold magnifying glass, he squinted at the covers and the inside pages one by one. He held the spine with its mysterious title up to the candle. He took considerable time over the frontispiece of the seated devil above a monogram. Remarkable, muttered Sir Veronal. Quite remarkable. He hesitated. For such rich fruit to fall so obligingly into his lap might be accident. Wealth and celebrity attracted good fortune more often than not. Or malevolent design, a false facsimile, perhaps? He turned back to the front, and there was the inscription, if fainter than he remembered it. I was bound bearing mysterious recipes. The writing he recognized, and the hidden message he already knew. He held the genuine article beyond the slightest doubt. I have the book and the stones. Fearing that his sense of triumph might come across, Sir Veronal launched a distraction, opening a page with a dog and bat in silhouette above the usual diagram, and a fearsome mix of the two on their right. Not a recipe book for pets, he said, as his mind continued to work out the consequences of this outrageous stroke of luck. All he needed now was the location of the white tile. Still, he must give Mr. Strimmer a little more to secure his trust. He closed the book and placed his right hand on the cover as if taking the oath. Elizabethan, 1571. The numerical letters M, D, L, X, X, I are spread about in order, buried close to the spine. You need my glass to see them, but the monogram repays special attention. Monogram! It's a place, not a person, he explained. As is the way with monograms, the answer, once revealed, appeared blindingly obvious. Sir Veronal ran his fingers along the lines. An O, a Y, and a H. Hoy. The town had several presses. This one ceased to be active in about this time. The title is obscure, but it must be rare indeed to merit binding of this quality. My turn, I think. Where did you find it? Strimmer described the small recess in the floor of the observatory room at the top of the North Tower. There had been no room for a companion volume, he said, adding that Valorhand knew nothing of the book. He did not mention Robert Flask as the man who had tipped him off about the unusual profile of the North Tower's roof. The book, after all, had been his discovery. Sir Veronal found the explanation amusing. Winter had chosen the hiding place for his most precious artifact well, no doubt foreseeing that in the event of his fall, the authorities would close the observatory as a mark of respect to Grassolf. Strimmer saw a question he should have asked at the beginning. You say you came in search of your past, but what told you your past was here? A letter. That's not very informative. Your mayor said he was prompted to write by a Paul Marl, but the man does not exist. I assume Mr. Snorkel was after my money. If so, he succeeded. The letter used the term outsider. It struck a chord, but I've yet to learn why. There are hidden layers here, thought Strimmer. How did Snorkel know to ask Sir Veronal? Does anyone else know of your tower room? Nobody. The answer was prompted by vanity. After all, he had discovered the room. Flask had merely encouraged him to look, indirectly. Valorhand, why does she oppose me? She's a perverse exhibitionist. Don't waste your time on her. Her performance required courage, if that's what you call a reckless search for limelight. Sir Veronal nodded and stood up, the questioning phase apparently over. I have two requests. I shall reward you for both. First, I wish to borrow your book, and I do mean borrow. Second, I would like you to watch Valorhand, what she gets up to, whom she sees. What reward exactly? You may choose certain money now, or a chance of power later. Strimmer sensed a test. 2 caskets, one banal, the other transforming. I can wait. Sir Veronal nodded approvingly. Strimmer could not explain his decision rationally. He knew Sir Veronal was ruthless, and yet he felt a nascent trust between them. Sir Veronal appeared to read his thoughts. I've traveled the world a long time. Kindred spirits are hard to come by. I have a final question which you needn't answer. Your age? 32. And you? A coldness flitted by. incongruous after their mutual openness or on far more intrusive questions. As the older man, I declined to answer that one. On the tiny balcony, a misshapen cat wobbled precariously. As Sir Veronal craned his neck, it arched its back, spat, and leapt into the street. I drowned such things at birth, said Strimmer. An experiment gone wrong, perhaps, replied Sir Veronal. Strimmer, no stranger to dark humour, found the inflection in the remark odd. Strimmer left the meeting with mixed feelings. He believed that Sir Veronal had observed the rules of the game and told no lies, which meant that the Roman recipe book had used beyond its rarity value. As to his own prospects, he felt he had passed the preliminary interview, but tougher tests lay ahead. Money was power, and Sir Veronal had the wherewithal to display Snorkel. His coattails were well worth hanging on to. There's a picture of some creatures with the caption, an experiment gone wrong, perhaps. Although the creatures aren't really cats. Not sure what the connection is. Probably mostly creative. Chapter 4. Oblong in Search of His Muse. Keats' nightingale, which, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease, had infected Oblong with an interest in ornithology, in the hope that he might produce a work of similar permanence. With acquaintance, the interest deepened, despite the absence of any artistic byproduct, although his fieldwork suffered from an inability to remember defining features: leg color, eye patch, tail shape. Woken by a territorial wren in the ivy beneath his bedroom window, he felt a surge of ambition. If fine poetry could flow at dusk in a country churchyard, why not during the dawn chorus in Grove Gardens? From April the gates stayed open, and at this early hour on a Saturday he would be untroubled by human company. Thunder had crackled in the night, but cloud and humidity had cleared. Notebook in pocket, Oblong hurried through the streets. Shadows still prevailed, but bars and pools of light were beginning to appear and spread. The cobbles glistened. Words came and went, half-lines, titles, adventurous rhymes. Once in the gardens, he settled on a stone bench near the edge of the cliff. The birds sang with gusto, but his muse stayed away. Thoughts refused to knit together. He decided to probe the garden's darker corners. Grove Gardens took its name from the life-size statue of a druid, leaning forward in an attitude of defiance, the staff leveled eastwards across the river. Frost damage repaired with modern materials lent the old priest an unflattering, blotchy complexion. Salt's design fitted the garden to the name, and the druid to the garden. Slender trees, mostly silver birch, suggested a grove, and the rock benches resembled fallen megaliths. Swaths of Haman's muscari, multicolored white and blue, hung over the paths, whose elliptical route fostered an illusion of space with sporadic open views of the river. Dead tree stumps supported wild roses and clematis, in bud but not yet in flower. At the path's end, a lantern hung on an ornate iron frame swathed in honeysuckle that created a bower-like effect, scene of many a Rotherweird marriage proposal. A bird trilled, warning or welcome? The ambiguity held literary promise, but was it a visiting warbler or a resident chaffinch? He moved to get closer and tripped. He looked down and managed only a curdled cry. Two stockinged legs protruded unmoving from the foliage, toes pointing upwards. He did not want to see the face. He did not want to touch anything. He retreated a few steps and then ran, mouthing like a fish the single syllable, help. Half glancing back, he collided with the ample frame of him and Salt. Bitten by something? Asked Salt. There's... Salt took Oblong by both shoulders and shook him twice, firmly. There's what? The legs by the lantern, stuttered Oblong. Show me. Shame gripped Oblong as Salt showed the calm head he had so conspicuously lacked. The gardener instructed him to keep back and took a roundabout route so as not to disturb any clue. He crawled into the undergrowth and checked for any sign of life, then clambered back and pointed out to Oblong the blistered paintwork on the lantern and the melted wires. Emotion registered in Salt's face and voice, but with restraint. Horrible, he said. I knew her. Was she? A lightning strike, but not without its oddities. Salt watched Oblong, mouth still agape, and decided against allowing him to go, lest he blurt out the news before the next of kin had been told. Come with me, he added. Where? Baubles and relics, replied Salt. Ever level-headed, Salt locked the gates as they left. Aurelia the early riser greeted them, mug of coffee in hand. The historian and the gardener, what can I do for you? An astute reader of body language, her tone changed in an instant. What's happened? To whom? Salt recited the facts without embroidery, adding comfort only at the end. I'm so sorry. Aurelia stood up. I need to see the body, she said, her numbed state of mind giving way to an urge to be positive. It isn't pretty. Nothing more was said. Oblong felt an urge to speak, but Salt gave him a deterrent look. The first countryside stalls passed them on the Golden Mean, and the newspaper boys were out. In the gardens, the magical early light had given way to morning as the birdsong subsided. Salt unlocked and then locked the gates behind them and stood back with Oblong as Aurelia crawled into the tangle of leaves. She did not emerge quickly. Salt stood downcast as in meditation. The gesture seemed right, and Oblong followed suit. Aurelia rubbed earth from her face. She held Mrs. Banter's handbag. Her personal effects. I don't want anyone going through them. Of course, said Oblong lamely. It must have been instant, added Aurelia. Yes, said Salt. Of course, chipped in Oblong. Thank you for finding her early. I couldn't bear the thought of a crowd. She liked her dignity. Oblong blushed. I'll get the arrangements done, said Salt. You mentioned oddities, and you were right. She's dressed to the nines, and her watch is frozen at midnight. Aurelia bit her lip as she spoke. The bare words might be those of a detective, but she did not sound like one. Scarily self-possessed, thought Oblong, and Salt appeared to agree. You really want to discuss this now? Salt asked. Very much. It's our discussion to have. There's something odd about the shoes. They look new. They are new. There are scuff marks on the heels as if she'd been dragged. Lightning would throw you, I think. Unfortunately, we can't be sure because the path is disturbed. Salt did not mention Oblong's clumsiness. There was thunder in the night, added Oblong, desperate to contribute, but Aurelia continued her dialogue with Salt. The oddest thing of all is why she came here so late. To meet whom, and why did he or she take no action? He, surely. Those shoes, that dress. When she nodded, he continued. We've had another freak lightning strike in recent weeks, remember? What positive motive could Slickstone have? Possible motive. Aurelia's final observation came on impulse. They'll cover this up. Don't tell the town hall I was here, or Oblong. You found the body. Not for the first time, Oblong felt relegated to the periphery of events. They left the gardens. Salt arranged for the undertaker to remove the body. Oblong returned home, and Aurelia entered Mrs. Banter's house with the keys from her bag. The house looked undisturbed. An array of dresses draped across the bed testified to a desire to impress. Yet hitherto Mrs. Banter had shown no interest in finding a replacement for Mr. Banter. Aurelia climbed up to the tower rooms and stumbled on a side of her aunt that she had never even guessed at. The two powerful telescopes on their tripods were bizarre enough, but the rows of notebooks in alphabetical order, all crammed with observation, spoke of a voyeuristic obsession with the lives of her fellow citizens. Aurelia shuddered. She knew their purpose. Social leverage. Prurience is an insinuating vice. Aurelia could not resist perusing a few selected volumes. Mrs. Banter's pungent notes yielded no joy and much sadness, as with the disheartening number of visits by Fangwin without his wife to the journeyman's gist since his dismissal. A broken man was her aunt's note. To her irritation, her aunt had detailed her own nocturnal movements with wounding accuracy. Goes to a party, returns alone again. Not everyone's movements were so conventional. Vixen Valorhand apparently vaulted the rooftops at night. She dithered. Revealing such a library to the authorities would tarnish her aunt's memory, but their retention would be a serious breach of the history regulations. When in doubt, buy time. She returned the books and dismantled the telescopes, and only then did she notice that the SA to SL volume was missing. S for Slickstone? Surely her aunt had not been foolish enough to attempt to blackmail Sir Veronal, but if so, what with? He hardly ever ventured beyond the manor. She turned her attention to Mrs. Banter's desk diary, a tale of bridge evenings and cocktail parties, which stalled at the end of February, nothing thereafter but blank pages, save for a tea-time visit from Lady Slickstone. She remembered her aunt's distressed state after the party and sensed a missing chapter. Then the shell of rational analysis dissolved. The drab tidiness of her aunt's life, guilt at the lack of warmth between them, and the thought that she might have prevented this tragedy had she known more, assailed her. She knelt by the bed and wept. When she eventually returned to Baubles and Relics, she found the town hall messenger on the doorstep, where he delivered a predictably sanitized version of a most unhappy death. Rotherweird had no police service, so all deaths were investigated by Morse Valet, the town undertaker, himself an habitué of Snorkel's soirees. The bizarre circumstances of Mrs. Banter's demise alarmed the mayor. It's odd, said Valet. Her date scarpered, or didn't show. Do you blame him? Valet persevered. You'll recall, your worship, an electrical incident at a recent party. Coincidence, maybe, but some might wonder. A is for accident, Snorkel said firmly. Don't complicate. A lantern incinerates and a woman dies. Bad luck, but it happens. As for this date of yours, he doesn't turn up, or if he does, he misses the body in the dark. Who's the next of kin? Aurelia Rock, Bubbles and Relics. Arty type, isn't she? They're the worst. Close it down, Valet, close it down. Valet thought of his Grace and Favor residence and the plush upholstery in his Grace and Favor rickshaw. Rocking boats was rarely wise. He wrote the word accident on the front of the shiny new file headed Mrs. Deirdre Banter, deceased. The ensuing notice in the Rotherweird Chronicle had a predictable blandness, with an undertone of tastelessness to the few who knew the true facts. It mirrored the way Morse Valet had delivered the news to Aurelia. Deirdre Banter, widow of the well-known architect, was found dead yesterday after a sudden heart attack suffered in the vicinity of Grove Gardens, which will be closed for a week as a sign of respect. The mayor complimented her contribution to Rotherweird society and offered his condolences to Miss Aurelia Rock, her niece, who has promised business as usual for the family antique shop Bubbles and Relics. Closed out of respect. Workmen would be in the gardens at this very moment, rewiring, repainting, and raking over the unexplained drag marks in the gravel. Mrs. Banter's dress and shoes had been returned, but not the watch. Banter, Deirdre, widow of Bartholomew Banter, architect, died without issue on. Marmion's Finch quill scratched in the date, reducing another life to a statistic in the Great Register, where, in alphabetical order, arrivals rubbed shoulders with departees in respectively green and red ink. She had been a friend, or rather rival, of Mrs. Finch, with their common interest in social advancement and the Rotherweird riparians, until her recent and unexplained ostracism. Finch distrusted the town hall when it dismissed troubling events with bland explanations. A picture of rude health. Mrs. Banter's doctor had confided in Finch earlier that day. She must have been overcome by the blossom. The word architect tripped a memory. Finch rarely visited the heavy folios that held the original designs for the town's oldest buildings. Their historical voice was too rich even for him. Now he opened the plans for his scutcheon place. One man's vision realized in bricks, beams, and mortar. The designer's name, Peregrine Banter. The manor reopens. A descendant, in name at least, of the founding father dies in rude health. The gold key round his neck weighed more heavily with every passing day. I had planned 2 more pages. What do you think? Yeah, it's either today or it is tomorrow. Okay. 5. Last rites. Attendance at Mrs. Banter's funeral service was modest. Mrs. Snorkel represented the mayor and stayed no longer than the decent minimum. Salt sat near the front and sang heartily. Oblong at the back mumbled along. Outside, Salt had patted him on the back, and Aurelia awarded him the faintest of smiles. A sprinkling of shop owners made up the numbers. A young priest spoke well, less about God and more about the existence of dimensions of which man knew nothing. At the end of the service, a woman with a black mantilla over her face wafted up to Aurelia and whispered, "I cannot say how sorry I am. I do hope your fortunes change." Aurelia did not know the voice, but it had elegance. Aurelia would have followed her, but the undertaker approached with a small jet-black urn. "Such a tragic accident. he said, almost apologetically. Anxious to complete the last rites, she cajoled Salt into joining her. Beyond the finishing line for the great equinox race, the banks narrowed and the river flowed faster and deeper. She emptied the ash into the Rother, and as the thin grey film passed out of sight, she shed a tear or two. I should have been kinder to my aunt, she mumbled. We are how we are, and there's naught so strange as folk, replied Salt, not one of nature's grief counsellors. Can a man throw lightning? No, said Salt. You're upset. There's much electricity in the human body. No. Anyway, why would Slickstone kill your aunt? Think of the risks. Kill her for driving a hard bargain? Aurelia could only agree it made no sense. Even the removal of the S volume from Mrs. Banter's secret library required theft, not murder. And if he did kill her, continued Salt, why did Lady Slickstone come to the service? You mentioned the threat to Lost Acre. Suppose that's what connects. Lost Acre is gone for all I know, grumbled Salt. They parted on the river bank, Salt leaving to check the island field colonies of the Rotherweird eglantine for blossom. Among Rotherweird's more peculiar legal instruments were the inheritance supervision orders, issued by the town hall on the death of anyone over the age of 18. The policy was, as ever, to discourage any interest in history. The nearest relative of sound mind had to weed out from the deceased effects any material more than 20 years old, including letters, diaries, and photographs, which were later collected by the town hall scrutineer for destruction. Aurelia returned to her aunt's house and rifled through her papers with little return. Business aside, Mrs. Banter had not been given to writing or receiving letters, still less taking personal photographs. On her return to Baubles and Relics, she checked through the attic storeroom. In a hat box, among invoices for the original refurbishment of the shop, 2 nondescript black sheets of paper enfolded a mounted sepia photograph of her great-grandfather, Roy Rock, the owner of the Coracle and an amateur photographer and naturalist. He stood at the foot of a woodland bank with a large butterfly on the flat of his open hand. Above him sat an incongruous figure on his haunches, holding a parasol. A manuscript caption read, R. and the Purple Emperor, Rotherweird Westwood, 1893. Aurelia remembered the family story. Roy Rock had sought the Purple Emperor since childhood, the most elusive of woodland butterflies, which fed on aphid honeydew high in the canopy, descending on him briefly to lay their eggs or to feed on less rarefied substances. One summer day far from town, in a shoal of ancient oak trees, an elderly man had appeared with a parasol. He had asked a simple question. Do you have a killing jar? I wish only to watch them. Roy Rock had confirmed his pacifist intentions by pointing to his notebook, tripod, and camera. What are you missing? Apatura iris, replied Roy, to test the stranger. Follow me, he replied. As they walked, the old man, his parasol still up despite the woodland shade, had explained how the lower slopes had once been entirely wooded. He had shown Roy Rock a cluster of purple emperors, feeding on a salt lick. The old man never gave a name, and later proved untraceable. Generations of Rocks nicknamed him Quirk, after the Latin for oak, but he had never been seen again. The photograph confirmed the old story, but much more besides. Despite the dappled light, the seated figure was unmistakable. Ferenzane, or a double of Ferenzane. It made no sense. How could he have been there then? This unsettling feeler from the past prompted another thought. On the white wall of her bedroom, she projected the photographs taken in the manor's attic on the night of the party. 2/3 of the way across the tapestry's mythical narrative appeared a man in a cage. She had taken the golden threads descending towards him to be a blessing, but now she had doubts. Lightning? She stood up close. Something about the cage caught her eye. Tiny dots of color, the color of the stones. Making many things of living things. In other cages there were monsters, mixes of man and animal or animal and bird. She went up to the screen and shuddered. Again on some of the bars, but never more than once to a side and never on the same bar in the same place, appeared a tiny dot of color, red, blue, white, or brown. Aurelia suddenly felt afraid. This wasn't myth at all, but history, real history reaching out across the years. She mulled over where to take her suspicions. Salt had hidden private agendas. She didn't know Ferencin well enough, and there was truth in Salt's complaint that he garnered more information than he gave. She sensed a flaw in Ferencin too, which she couldn't place for all his apparent wisdom. A thought came to her and she began to write, holding nothing back. In disregard of Salt's instruction, she mentioned Ferencin and the photograph. She explained the sale of the stones, her aunt's observations, the library of notebooks, the missing volume, and her theory about her aunt's untimely death in Grove Gardens. On the envelope, she wrote, "Strictly private and confidential, Marmion Finch, Esquire, Escutcheon Place." She delivered it by hand herself early the following morning. On her return, she set about the shop, hustling between the basement and the ground floor, giving abandoned unsold stock a second chance, and relegating selected present failures. The old ruler had passed away, the state funeral had been held, and now the new regime could show its style. Within days, the hippopotamus head, subject of so many of Mrs. Banter's spiky barbs, had sold. The suffocating fog of bereavement began to lift. And on that slightly positive note, we will end today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Spooky stuff happening in Rotherweird. How was this session? Are you still sort of remembering as you go along?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember her death for some reason, but I do remember him selling. I do remember the truth conversation. So bits of it I remember, but it really didn't stick for some reason.
I remembered her death from before because it was kind of a catalyst there.
Yeah, I was quite surprised I didn't remember it, but for some reason it didn't stick. I say none of this book seems to have stuck. Like I remember enjoying it, but none of the story really seems to have stuck beyond the theme.
Also,
so I'm totally enjoying hearing it.
Oh, thank you. More bits of Slickstone being horrible with his zapping of the flies and moths.
Yes.
On the flip side, though, I imagine it in a sort of amusing, cartoonish way of zap, flutter, 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 zap.
I do have to
Mosquito by
admit
the
to having
ear,
a zappy
zap.
thing myself. I do have to admit to having a zappy thing myself for dealing with irritating, biting, flying things.
Yeah, but you can't shoot lightning from it, can you?
No, I do have a Tesla coil, but it doesn't actually kill flies.
Hmm. Okay.
They seem to get quite confused around it, but then they drop down and then they fly off fine.
Interesting. Well, it's getting kind of late for me, and we should probably say goodnight to Catch Up Crew. Have we got any wisdom for them?
Celebrate tiny roots.
That sounds
They won't
good to
get
me.
it because you didn't start the recording at that point, but it's good wisdom.
Okay. Catch Up Crew. We have tiny roots and even tinier roots. For context. And with that,
You're
good
nice,
night, everyone. We love you. Bye.
Right.